Welcome to The Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome back, Carrie Sheffield.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Last time we were here, you were coming from Independent Women's Forum, and our mission was to talk about the Federal Reserve and monetary policy and the economy, of which you're an expert. You were an analyst at Goldman Sachs, as I recollect.
Yes.
And we got to talking, and then we wandered into the fact you'd written a book called Motorhome Prophecies, and then you started teasing that a bit. And I said, let's skip Jay Powell. We don't need to talk about the Federal Reserve. Let's talk about your book. And since then, I guess that was last July, 2023. Since then, you've written the book. It's about to be published.
Yep.
And I've got a PDF version that I bootlegged into my Kindle, and so I've read it. It's riveting, and it's just astonishing because I feel like as you sitting here, I really know you, and you've got an incredibly vivid human story to tell, and you've got the period where you're living with your family in a motorhome. Your father thought he was a Mormon prophet. You left the Mormon church when you're 22 or 23, and then you went through, I think, secular hell, as I would think about it, and then became Christian. And it's transformed your life.
It really has. And I think in some ways my life is almost like a microcosm of kind of what's happening with the West. And I know you explore this a lot on your show.
Yeah, all the time.
That the West is committing suicide. And partially because of all the CRT stuff and the toxic interpretation of DEI, they're rejecting Western principles because the West is not perfect. And so they throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is what I did when I became, as you said, a secular agnostic, because I was so angry at the Judeo-Christian interpretation that had been thrown on me by a very toxic family environment. So it took a while for me to disentangle what was true, what was good, from what was abusive and toxic. And I think that a lot of people, especially a lot of younger people, they're going through similar challenges and existential crises. That's why you're seeing the suicide rate skyrocket. You know, we had the highest suicide rate in American history ever recorded in 2022. We just got that data late last year. And the fastest growing group was women 25 to 34. So you had a 7% growth in the suicide rate among that age group. So I wrote the book almost like a letter to my younger self. I wish that I'd had the book then, because it's like...
Well, you went through that 22 to 35 despair yourself personally.
Exactly, yeah. And so I see the book as, you know, and I just spoke to the Pepperdine University conservative newspaper, did an interview with them. I'm speaking to Palm Beach Atlantic University later this month. I've spoken at Liberty University. I love speaking to young people to talk about life, because when you're young, and especially in my case, when I didn't have older figures in my life that were mentors that I trusted, that I respected, that were leading lives that I wanted to lead because I felt philosophically aligned with them, I just turned to pop culture, and that's a mess. And so I wrote the book almost like I said.
You turned to pop culture for wisdom and advice.
Yes.
Big mistake.
Very big mistake.
So we talked about it last time, but for anybody who didn't watch the earlier episode, you ought to go back and look at it. But after that plug, let me jump into this episode. Just recount the outline of life with your family in the motorhome and your father, who was, anyway, I won't put words in your mouth. Tell that story.
So I call the book Motorhome Prophecies because my father, as you mentioned, he believes he's a Mormon prophet. He'll be 86 in a couple months. He has very severe Alzheimer's. As I said in the introduction, I pray for him. I know that he's struggling. And I try to be as honest in the book about the reasons why I believe he became the way he was. And the short of it was that because he believed he had this prophetic call that he would become president someday, that he had
Of the United States.
Of the United States, that he had this call on him and on our family. And he said that Satan himself had personally reassigned, was the word. He had reassigned lesser demons in order for Satan himself to personally attack our family. And in order to accomplish this call on his life, he said that we need to go wherever the Holy Ghost says, and we're going to live in a motorhome. Sometimes we lived in houses as well. We lived in sheds and tents. My mother gave birth when the brother just ahead of me was born, when the family was living in a tent in Greenbelt Park, Maryland, in a campground. So it was almost like medieval times.
And you had 4 older brothers and 3 younger sisters?
2 younger sisters and a younger brother. So eight
So 8
surviving.
altogether, and your mother and father in a motorhome.
Yep, 10 people.
Where'd everybody sleep?
So the 3 girls were in the overhang. So, you know, a lot of motorhomes have this little overhang over the driver's cab. So the 3 girls in the overhang. Then my parents in the fold-out couch that became a bed, the day bed basically. It just folds out into a couch. The couch folds out into a bed. And then in the back room, the 4 boys were stacked 2 and 2. My dad, he fancied himself a carpenter, and so he made bunk beds in the back room, and had the 4 boys stacked on top of each other. And then the youngest one was against the back wall that was where the day bed, and he was on the cushion back there.
So this wasn't necessity, this was a choice. Your father, as you describe him, was a strapping guy, 6 feet, blue eyes, blonde hair. His family was extremely successful. His father was financially successful. A lot of other people in the family, a whole raft of people, highly talented, highly successful. He chose this life.
Right. Yeah. In many ways, his story was riches to rags. It's the opposite of the American dream.
Yeah.
Because he said his father had gotten his money through ill gains. My late grandfather, was a very successful real estate developer in Utah, but he had bought some properties on foreclosure. And my dad tells the story once of a woman just coming to their house and just rapping on their window and saying, you know, "You stole my house, Ralph Sheffield, you're an evil man." And that just struck my dad. And the thing about my dad is, you know, as I'm surrounded by art and music, and he's a very creative person. He had the honor of winning a nationwide composer contest for the up-and-coming young composer, and he got first place and he won. And he tells the story of they open the envelope and they say, "Where the hell is Provo, Utah?" You know, because this is, you know, around the 1960s or so, and
Sure.
Utah was a lot less known. And then he got that from his grandmother, or from his mother, my grandmother, she had done something similar, but it was for the entire LDS Church, the global LDS Church.
LDS, Latter-day Saints.
Latter-day Saints,
Yeah,
the Mormon
Latter-day
Church.
Saints,
That's
yeah.
the nickname that they've tried to get away from, the LDS Church. And today the LDS Church has 17 million people. Back then it was, you know, a lot less, but still millions of people. They had a contest, and she won that contest for her. She wrote some musical plays. So that's where he got the talent. He ended up also being a protege of Andre Segovia on classical guitar. And Andre Segovia, as I talk about in the book, was probably to date the known best classical guitarist in the world. He has an asteroid named after him. He has 10 honorary doctorates. He had Lifetime Grammy Achievement Award. He was knighted by the King of Spain. So he hand-selected my father to be one of his proteges. And then my father was a professor at Brigham Young University of Guitar. So he had all these accolades. And then he said he gave up his secular music career in order to be this prophet, because he was called to go and play his beautiful music with a little amplifier plugged into the bass of his guitar, you know, gorgeous music. And then he would attract people, and then he would pass out brochures.
At
that
what
had a
age
bunch
did
of
you
Mormon
go
quotes.
on the road, personally? Were you a baby? Were you born on the road?
The road's a tricky word, because we moved so much. So I guess
You went to 18 schools.
Yeah, 17 public and homeschool. So yes.
Okay.
18 schools. And so doing homeschool in particular made it a lot more easy. We did that when I was in high school later on, which I'm surprised my parents didn't do it sooner, but I was actually glad that we didn't, because at least I had some exposure to the outside world. You know, he said that it was God's will for us to go and play. So he did it himself first, by himself, playing the music and then passing out the brochures. The brochures were the key to the mission call. So the brochures were folded up, quotes and quotes and quotes from the Bible, from the Book of Mormon, from himself, from patriotic leaders, to try to instill this fusion of faith in God and the Mormon faith, which, you know, there's a dispute about, and I get into the book a bit about the theology of Mormon versus Protestant, Catholic, kind of mainstream.
Well, that's interesting.
Christians.
I do want to get into that whenever it's appropriate in the story
Sure.
to tell it. But so you ended up having problems with Mormonism, period, because of their theology.
Later on.
But he had problems with Mormonism for different reasons.
Yes.
And he didn't really leave the Mormon faith, but he thought he had a better version of it. And I guess there are now dozens, if not hundreds, of split-offs from the Mormon church that are similar to what he was doing.
Oh, from the beginning, there's been constant splinter groups. So even I describe it as similar to Shiite and Sunni in Islam. So Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, there was a dispute when he was assassinated about whether or not it should be a genetic descendant of him or a spiritual call to be the next prophet. Because similar to the Catholic Church, there's only one official prophet at a time. And so there was a schism about people who said it has to be someone in the Smith family versus somebody who was spiritually called. And so the spiritual call fell on Brigham Young. So the biggest group that's in Salt Lake, that's the Brigham Young Church. That's the big official one that you see that Mitt Romney was in. But there have been many other schisms. And, you know, my father, I say that he was kind of almost like a Walmart Joseph Smith, in the sense that we were always in Walmart parking lots at our motorhome, but he was also less successful than Joseph Smith.
So I like going to Walmart, but
I do too. They got great prices.
They're actually pretty good. So so many questions pop out of that. So he had issues with, but the Mormons deny the divinity of Christ. They call him the older brother.
Yes.
And that's a big difference.
So they don't believe in the Trinity, and that
Right.
is the central difference. That
God, Christ, Holy Ghost, Trinity.
Yeah, so they believe there's a distinct physical genetic body, the Father, who is distinct genetic difference body, Jesus. And so that is a big difference. And then also this idea of being joint heirs with God, that the God of earth was a former human, and because he was righteous and did good works, he became a God through his works. And that you, Bill, if you were a Mormon man, you could be God of your own planet if you get married in the temple and you do all the righteous Mormon works. And you can have multiple wives.
Well, you said in your book, and we want to get into your personal story, but you said in the book that Mormonism is highly defective spiritually, but it's very attractive in this earth because of what the message it gives to members and their exalted place in it. Just like I can be a god in my own domain. That sounds pretty good.
I mean, I describe the LDS Church today as, from my perspective, again, this is my perspective, theologically wrong, culturally strong.
That's the way,
here in America
that
is
was
how
the
I
phrase,
distill
yeah.
it, because and I have, you know, a lot of my cousins and aunts and uncles who are still in the church. So I say in the book, I'm not here to attack the church, but I'm always happy to engage in a respectful conversation, dialogue, talk about the reasons theologically that I disagree with the church. But if you look at the fruit of the culture, Utah has the top social mobility, that a child born in the bottom quintile of economics has the greatest likelihood of making it to the top because of such strong social ties. There's really strong social capital in Utah, in part because it's the strongest state with two-parent homes. And as we know, as conservatives, That's the top variable as to whether a
The
child
number,
succeeds.
the number one variable.
Yep. And so Utah has very strong families, the strongest in the whole country, in part because of the Mormon culture. And I do say it is a double-edged sword because theologically, they do believe that family life occurs, the family bonds occur in the afterlife, but only if you're righteous. So if you had a child and you were married in the LDS temple, if that child did not fully participate and go to the temple as well, then you would be separated from that child for eternity because they weren't Mormon.
Well, it's hard for me to watch television reports when they're showing inner city black on black violence and riots and things like that, and not go quickly to an explanation that the number of these kids that are born in a two-family or two-parent household is close to, what, 10, 12, 14%, something like that. There are no fathers in those houses.
Yeah, and it's interesting because
By the way, we're veering way off topic here. We're not going to
There are
talk
many
about Jay
rabbit
Powell.
holes.
We're not going to talk about Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve, though. We won't cover that.
there's a way we can get back there, I'm sure. No, but I think for the families, yes, it's interesting. There are conservatives, I love AEI, but they had a seminar 2 nights ago.
American Enterprise Institute.
Yes,
yeah.
the American Enterprise Institute with Bradford Wilcox, who
He's
a big
the
fan.
family guy.
Yeah, and he's written a book called "Get Married and Defy the Elites." I think that's the title. And I love the concept, and he presents some great research, but the conversation, to me, it didn't address at all what happens in underclass culture. And I say this as someone who grew up exposed to it. If you are traumatized, and what's happening right now is intergenerational trauma. And that's why I wrote the book, is that I wanted to help sever the bonds of intergenerational trauma. And by that I mean, if you're born in the inner city and you're surrounded constantly by violence, gangs, drugs, single parenthood, you don't know any different. That's all you know. And so it's a traumatic environment. And so when you grow up, you become a traumatized adult, which is what happened to me, which is why I ended up dating abusive, drug-addicted, alcoholic men, because it's all that I knew. So when Brad Wilcox says, just go get married, it's like, no, because what's going to end up happening, like in my sister's case, she married an alcoholic man who beat her and then abandoned her. So yes, she got married like Brad Wilcox wanted, but I'm so glad I didn't marry these men, because I would have married an abuser.
It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. It's not just getting married, but it's all the other.
Well, yes, I think he talks about the success sequence. The success sequence is you need to, complete high school, and then before you get married, and then have the baby. And if you do that, you have a 97% chance of being out of poverty. But the thing is, nobody follows that success sequence because they're traumatized. There's things inside you that make you believe that you're not worthy, that you can't do it, or that it's not worth it.
Well, I want to steer us back towards what's in your book, because everybody needs to read it. It's hard reading in places because it's so vivid, and what you went through in some ways is excruciating to read about. And I took the PDF you sent me and I've translated it into Kindle. When's the book coming out?
March 12th.
March 12th.
Yes.
March 12th, 2024. But I was able to get it into Kindle. And you can do a notebook in Kindle. And just the first notes I've got here from page 19, your father, who you call Ralph, we'll get into that, didn't believe in health insurance. Talk about intergenerational issues. He thought health insurance was just for people plotting office jobs. And so he wouldn't go to an emergency room even because he didn't want to pay out of pocket. And so at one point you fell, hurt yourself, major gash in your head. And instead of going to the emergency room, he did what?
Well, it was Christmas time, and he said, well, Carrie, we can use the Christmas money that I'd spend to buy your siblings presents to buy them presents or to take you to the ER to sew up the back of your head. You choose.
Oh my God! So that was not.
What do you
just
think I'm going to choose?
So
Do you
this
think I
was
want my 7
psychological
siblings to
abuse
hate me?
too. So are you going to be a selfish kid, or are you going to let? And so
Yeah.
he did what?
So he said, it's your choice, Carrie. So of course I chose that I didn't want my 7 siblings to hate me forever for stealing Christmas. So I said bravely, let's do it. So he did sew up the back of my head with.
He said using your mom's needle and brown thread, and while I was doing it, you could hear the excruciating sound of the punctured weaving reverberating through my skull.
Yeah.
You know, Carrie, you ought to become a writer. You're pretty good. That's vivid, and it's filled with vivid stories like that. And then he also didn't believe in dentists.
No. In
And so
fact,
he
my
did- he did-
incisor, yes, is totally dead.
And because he did what?
Because he would take the broken end of a popsicle stick and push it against my tooth. He was trying to save money by not getting me braces. And so he did straighten it a little bit, but it ended up deadening the root. So my tooth is brown. I've tried to whiten it, but it's totally dead, and I had to get a root canal as an adult.
So anyway, it turned out beautifully. But how old were you when that happened?
Let's see, when the sewing or the tooth? The tooth was kind of over a period of years
Okay.
as a teenager, maybe starting around 7th grade or so. But-
Okay. This is Bill Walton Show. I'm here with the amazing Carrie Sheffield, and we're talking about her book, Motorhome Prophecies, and we're kind of wandering all over the place talking about global societal issues and family formation, while at the same time talking about her own mostly horrific experience at the hands of her father.
Yeah, and I like I said, I try to get into why he did this, and I think it was a combination of his extreme narcissism. So the ingredients of a homespun Mormon prophet are, in his case, extreme gifting, highly, highly talented global music talent, sexual assault as a child, childhood trauma. He was very traumatized as a child. One of his trusted Mormon babysitters raped him, a female. And he said later on, as an adult, that assault made him suicidal. He had some other traumas that I talk about in the book. One of his best friends died in a sledding accident very suddenly. He also had one of his teachers try to get him to stay after class and offer him candy, which he was terrified about because he had read in the paper, his father had read to him about a stranger offering a boy candy, and then he raped him and murdered this little boy. So he was traumatized by his teacher, and then also a stranger had tried to do that with him as well. And so it was just no adults made him feel comfortable. And his own parents, when this woman assaulted him, the babysitter, they didn't call the police. They didn't get mental health treatment. They didn't even call the Mormon bishop. He said all they did was they got him a little shiny shovel toy, like one of these bulldozer toys. It was a hit in the neighborhood, but clearly didn't, help him heal from his childhood trauma. So combine the exceptional gifting, childhood trauma, with his interpretation of this magnificent doctrine of what a human can do in terms of become a god someday. Whether you agree with it or not, I don't, but he did. That all combined to become who he was.
Well, you explain in the book that there's a condition called emotional hypersensitivity, which is a neurodivergent individual thought to be increased deeper, blah, blah, blah. You go on. It's a pretty technical, but...
It's called an HSP, a highly sensitive person.
Yeah.
And there's a scale that anybody can test. It's called the Aronson scale. It was developed by a psychiatrist named Aronson. And I've done it, and I'm off the charts for all of the indicators.
You have
and
to say.
and I've, for my father, in fact, I was on a seminar a couple weeks ago with somebody, an expert in this field, because I wanted to learn more about it. As soon as I had heard about this, what exactly is HSP, highly sensitive people? It's not a disorder. It's a genetic wiring. So it's actually your neurological system is different in the sense that here's some of the differences. The way your serotonin and dopamine are managed, you have more active mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are the way that you mirror somebody. When you're talking to them, you kind of mimic them. You have empathy for them. So people who are HSPs, highly sensitive people, they're often called empaths because they have a very heightened sense of empathy. The insula and the cortex are more strongly activated. That's the certain regions of the brain. You have a stronger awareness of what's going on in your body, so you're more susceptible to just the sensations of hunger, thirst, emotions. And then your ventromedial prefrontal cortex is more active and gives the vividness of emotions a greater sensitivity. So I have a theory, and I need to do more research, but I do believe that musicians are much more likely to be HSP, which my father was, and I've got his genetic code too. So, and I'm a musician, I'm not at his level, but I'm an HSP. And so learning that even now as an adult, I understand myself more because I'm like, well, this explains why I let toxic partners into my life, because I feel sorry for them. And then I'm kind to them because I feel sorry for them, but they don't return the favor.
Well, the book covers your years from age. You went from a cocoon essentially when Ralph, and you called your father Ralph, had the whole family either in a motorhome or houses moving from town to town, and I expect he was one step ahead of the law, and so he didn't want to be in any one place too long. Mm-hmm. So you were isolated, cocooned in this warped world. And when you left it and you went to college and then later on, then you had to deal with the wider world as a hypersensitive person dealing with all these interrelationships. And that was tough.
It really was. And to make it even more complicated, HSPs are actually pretty common. Like according to this Aronson scale, it's about 15 to 20% of the population. It's pretty common. But most of the HSPs are introverts. I am an extrovert. I'm a natural extrovert. And so only about 2.5% of the entire population is an extroverted female HSP, which made me feel even more strange because I'm trying to process this as an extrovert, but I don't have the emotional tools because I wasn't taught healthy emotional regulation. And so, as one of my therapists said, when I escaped and ran away from home, which I have a chapter about escaping, I was afraid my father was going to commit violence against me if I left. I was able to leave, 4 a.m. with a good friend, but the tools.
That's when you were 18.
When I was 18.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the tools that it took to mentally break away from a mind-controlled cult, because I do describe what my dad did as a cult, and I'm very careful to say that what he did was separate from the LDS Church. In fact, he was excommunicated from the official LDS Church. But I do believe what he did to us was a cult. And so when I finally escaped from the cult, it took a lot of mental fortitude to be able to do that because I was the first to leave. Even though I have 4 older brothers, I was the first to leave, which meant I was the easiest to disown. And before I left, I told them I was going to leave. My dad raised his hand in the square and he said, "I prophesy in the name of Jesus, you'll be raped and murdered if you leave." And by that point, one of my 2 schizophrenic brothers had already tried to rape me and groped me.
This was your older brother, who was also a big guy.
Yeah, very tall and burly, and was able to fend him off. But at that point, it was part of why I left.
But he'd been completely isolated as well.
And he was the oldest, yeah. And so, I didn't blame him. I knew that it was his mental illness, but I knew that I wasn't safe, And so to have your father say,
but you,
it was a lot of, like my therapist said, the tools that it took to get me out of that place are a totally different set of tools to succeed in a nuanced marketplace and business environment, and I failed a lot.
Well, wait a second. You went to Harvard. You got a graduate degree from Harvard. You worked your first job when you were 22 was a research analyst for Robert Novak. You worked at American Enterprise Institute. You've been pretty successful in this environment now. But you thought.
Talked about how really grim her childhood was. That you and your brothers and sisters were each assigned an instrument and had to go out on the street corners and get money.
This is my wife Sarah, who we don't have time to bring a camera in, but anyway, what she's saying is, Kenny, the director, is saying, no, you can't do that. Next time, let's make it, let's get a mobile going.
Let her say that. She
Well, no, but I want to repeat it.
Yes.
She's my stage mother over there. Thank you, darling. But yeah, I mean, your father was a musician, and I was going to get to this. You ended up, you played the violin, but it turned out he had a master plan. And the master plan was each one of his children was going to learn an instrument because he wanted to create an ensemble that he could take on the road and make it part of his mission. And you had no choice. If you wanted to play the saxophone, that was out because that was not an approved instrument.
Correct. Exactly. Yes. And so he was building this in his head that was going to be his vehicle for this mission. Because I think in some respects, he was trying to create the sense of belonging that he never felt he had while he was a child. And then later while he was an adult, because he had been fired from BYU because he had been doing unauthorized concerts and events while he was in Spain and traveling around, sleeping in chapels, doing unauthorized things, which the LDS Church is very hierarchical. And so he was let go, and I think that he took that to say, well, fine, I'm going to go do my own thing and I'm going to do my own mission. So he did it himself, again, playing the music on the street corners and living off of what people put inside the money that people put inside his guitar case out in front, while passing out the brochures and trying to convert people to Mormon.
Well,
And the thing about the money was we were always living on the edge of collapse. We were on welfare. We were using Mormon church welfare. So the Mormon church has a wonderful welfare system to help people who are struggling. I personally think it should be a safety net. It shouldn't be a lifestyle because it's chronic. If you're living this way, it's chronic. It creates a permanent sense of chaos, a permanent sense of stress, and it wears on you.
what was life like day to day?
It was, well, and yes, as you said, we grew up and we were each assigned to all 8 of the children, and my mom were assigned the instruments to play. We all sang together as well. And I was assigned the violin and the oboe, so I played some oboe solos when we played Carmen, the opera Carmen. So that was the strangest part of it. One of the strangest parts, there are lots of strange parts, but
The oboe has the triple reed,
the double reed, yes.
double reed, so you have a
Mm-hmm.
lip.
It's been a while, but yes.
Okay, that's a very hard instrument to
It
play.
is. The embouchure is very difficult, which is part of why also it's not a very, you can't just go around the campfire and whip out your oboe and hang out. It's not like a casual instrument. So, or for a wedding. So I play violin and piano still. I stopped playing with the violin for a while because I was angry, but I've got it back up now. So I play for weddings. I played the piano and the violin for my aunt's funeral recently, and so those are nice. Those are more user-friendly instruments.
You
I
ended
would
up
say.
doing extremely well academically, despite all these movement and schools and things like that. Didn't you score 99 percentile on your verbal SATs?
Yeah, so I did really well, and that's part of what helped me escape was that I was able to get some scholarships to take the edge off going to college without having parental support that was consistent in any way. But to answer your question on day-to-day life, I had the dichotomy of this transcendent, beautiful music where we would spend hours and hours performing or practicing and rehearsing and then performing Beethoven. We played Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. We played Mozart's 40th Symphony. We played some Dvorak. We played some Grieg. Beautiful music. But then you're contrasting it with the abuse and the screams and the assaults. It was so jarring, and it just, in some ways, it became kind of commonplace to have that fusion of the two. But then eventually, as I got older, I saw it in the theology as well, or just the preaching, where it's my dad would be on the street corners preaching beautiful principles, the principles of Jesus, the principles of love. But then he would come home and he would, he broke my brother's rib. He knocked his tooth out, just assaults and screaming, and eventually I was like, he's not behaving the
Well,
way
you
he
thought
preached.
you researched your way out of his cult, though, because you began to grow skeptical of what he was teaching, and you found a catch of his notebooks, and you went and looked at the notebooks, and you began to reverse engine to think through what he was really preaching and how different that was from
Exactly.
talk about that.
Yeah, and that's sort of one of the reasons why it's called the Motorhome Prophecies, is because I found these handwritten prophecies that he had made. So we had this fiberglass trailer attached to the back of the motorhome, and that's where he had kept a bunch of his notes and his personal effects. By that point, I had been writing a bit for the local newspaper in this column called the Young Voices segment, and that gave me some confidence to know that I had some writing abilities. And he said at the time he wanted to write his autobiography, and so he said, would you help me to compile and type up? So I typed up some letters and just compiled them to be in an electronic format. It was very, ancient word processor. But so that's when I was going through these documents. I found letters from his mother when he was a missionary that were very concerning, because he was very arrogant to her and very preachy, telling her she wasn't devout enough, she wasn't a good enough Christian. And but then what really struck me, like you said, was finding these documents that he had handwritten. They were handwritten prophecies, and they were written in the Old English Elizabethan style, the way that
Thee and thou and
yes, the way that the King James version of the Bible is.
yes.
So LDS Scripture has 4 books. They've got the King James Bible, they have the Book of Mormon, they have the Pearl of Great Price, and then they have the Doctrine and Covenants. Of those 4, only the Doctrine and Covenants is purported to be a modern day document. The rest are supposed to be ancient. And Doctrine and Covenants is handwritten prophecies that Joseph Smith said he received from God on how to run the church while he was building it up. Well, what I found from my father was, and Joseph Smith wrote it in old school English as well, or at least that's the way it was published, in Elizabethan English, same. So basically, I saw a knockoff version of the Doctrine and Covenants in my own father's handwriting. And it was God talking to my father, but he was using his pen name, his God name, which was Daniel Strong. And he had told our family about Daniel Strong before, so I wasn't surprised by that, but I was shocked that my father was basically in black and white, seeing what he was doing, a knockoff version of Joseph Smith. I said, I started to shake, because I, at that time, was still very devout LDS. And like I said, there's only one prophet at a time descending from Joseph Smith spiritually. And I knew that my father was not that man. There was one prophet, he lived in Salt Lake, and he was not my dad. So at that point, it was a juncture. Do I support the LDS Church, or do I support my father? And I chose the church.
And this was, you were 17 or 18, and then you shortly thereafter you left.
Yes.
So you go to where'd you go to college? Several places, but you ended up at graduating from BYU.
Correct, yes.
And how'd you get into college from the motorhome?
Well, it's interesting, and I talk about this a little bit because there have been some pieces more recently in places like, I think the New York Times wrote something about it, and the Georgetown Hoya student paper wrote something about this, which is that entrance fees or application fees. So the Georgetown student paper said, we need to lower our application fees because the median household income for a Georgetown student, I think, was over $200,000, which is much higher
At
than
least,
average,
yeah.
at least. And maybe it's like 230, something like that. Much higher than the median household income for the average American. So they said, and part of it is the barrier of application fees. Well, in my case, that was 100% true. I did not have any money. I had maybe like $10 from like Christmas. My parents wouldn't let me get a job. They said because I was a girl, I wasn't allowed to work outside the home. They were afraid, even though my brothers were allowed to have paper routes and do other things. And since I was the first girl, I was the most controlled. And so I had no money. And so if I'd had money, I would have gone directly to BYU or potentially some other school, but I had no money. And so that was a big barrier to me going to BYU. The other barrier was they required a bishop's ecclesiastical endorsement. And I had theologically no problems getting it. I was I was slightly worried that the bishop might tell my father, and I didn't want my parents to know that I was applying. So that was the other reason why I didn't go directly to BYU.
So you were applying to schools without your parents knowing it?
No, because I was afraid. I was afraid. I didn't know what to expect because nobody in my family had gone away for college. And so I did it without them knowing because so it's funny sometimes when people are like, oh, I'm taking my son to campus visit day. We're driving over. I'm just like, this concept is so foreign to me. I don't
Exactly my
understand.
lived experience.
No. And when I spoke to the entire student body of Liberty University, like 10,000 students, and I was telling them my story a little bit. And I said, freshman week for you, peanuts compared to what I went through, because, thinking I'm going to be raped and murdered on campus pretty much immediately, like, because I'm disowned. My dad said my blood changed. I was no longer his daughter. I was not allowed home all through college because my dad said I was satanic. So no holidays, no summer breaks. And that's part of why I pushed myself to succeed in my career, was because it was all that I had in order to, for me, and I learned later this was toxic. But at the time, it was how I gained a sense of validation.
Sure. What school did you go to first before you transferred to BYU?
It's called Truman State University.
Okay, so that's where you got started. And then you worked your way, you waitressed and did various things to pay the rent.
Yeah.
Wow. I used to, it wasn't really a complaint, but I was a National Merit finalist. And my father, who didn't make enough money, didn't want me to apply for a scholarship because they didn't want to disclose his income. And I was getting applications sent to me from places like Harvard and Yale because they were looking for, but he said, nope, not going to do any of that. You're going to go to Indiana University, which is where I went, and the tuition was like $1,000. I was okay with it, but it was my tale of woe hardly compares.
Well, you know what you could
And you ended up at Harvard anyway.
Well,
I had a pretty good time in Indiana, but anyway. So,
well, you know what you could have done is
well, I needed you around as an advisor.
Exactly. Well, you could have gotten yourself declared legally estranged from him if you wanted to, because then at that point you wouldn't have needed his financial information. Because I went
He was
through that.
mad at me because I'd been admitted to the Naval Academy, and I didn't want to go.
Oh, why didn't you go?
I don't
would
know.
be
I
mad
was an
at you,
idiot.
Bill.
I was an idiot.
That's a great school.
I was 17 years old. I was dumb, but
You didn't want the basic training?
I don't remember my reasons why, but they were wrong, and so mistakes.
Oh.
But
Mistakes were made.
BYU, and then we're a long way into this interview, and I've covered about 2% of what I wanted to cover here, and the book
I will
goes
let
on.
you go.
You left the church, the Mormon church, so I did want to talk about that. That was when you were 22. You decided to do that. Why was that?
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter about that. And it's interesting because I had some people say, well, oh, you just want to leave because you want to go drink, or you just want to go look. I dated a guy, I kid you not, he said I wanted to leave because I wanted to look at pornography all day. And I was just like, what? This is ridiculous. No, I've never looked at porn. I have no interest. This is not why I'm leaving. Like, we're obviously not a match,
Yeah.
But I left for theological reasons. And it started in the spring term after. So BYU Paxton, they have fall, winter, spring, summer. They're very efficient. They have 4 terms. And so for the spring term of my junior year, I took a class called Journalism, History, and Philosophy. And for that class, they had us look at 1800s microfiche. So newspaper clippings from the newspapers, different newspapers. And the one that really caught my attention was called the Deseret News, which it's still around today. In fact, I used to work for it while I was a BYU student in the Utah County Bureau. But back then, it was this, it's owned by the LDS Church, so it's an official church publication. And scrolling through in the Harold B. Lee Library on campus, scrolling through the archives down in the basement, in the darkened basement, so you can look at the microfiche. These microfiche from the 1800s, I don't know exactly what years, the Mormons got to Utah in 1847, so it was probably maybe 1850s or 60s, I'm not exactly sure. But in any case, they were advertisements for alcohol and tobacco that were being sold by a department store called ZCMI, which was, I call it like the Mormon Macy's. It's now bankrupt, but at the time, and even when I was a kid, it was like a big deal. It's like a general store owned by the Mormon Church. They were selling alcohol and tobacco. And I was shocked. I was like, they're making money off these things that we're not allowed to use? This is so strange. They don't do this now. And I knew that, so it's called the Word of Wisdom, which is the health code. The Word of Wisdom was not enforced. I knew that it was not enforced until I think around the Prohibition era. So Mormons actually drank from when it was founded in 1830 up until around almost 100 years, where you could drink and you could do tobacco. They had some problems where apparently these Mormons were spitting tobacco all over the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith's house, and I guess his wife hated that. She was not a fan of tobacco being all over her carpet. So there was so that's part of why, just culturally it was kind of looked on.
These were not theological reasons.
Yes. Yeah, but it was the 1920s is when they enforced it. But at the same time, I was shocked to know that, okay, maybe they looked the other way, but this was not looking the other way. We're making money off this stuff from a church a store that's owned by the LDS Church.
Yeah.
It shocked me. And I was just like, what else is there that I don't know? And so that became my first big investigative journalism project was when I was a kid, is my dad a prophet? I came to that realization, no. My second big investigative project, do I believe the LDS Church? I did the best I could. I found a lot more things about the history and the theology that really, really concerned me. And so I decided to leave. And that was the first time in my life that I felt suicidal. And I was 21. And I had never, despite all the other traumas, I had been, depressed and things like that, but I'd never been suicidal until that moment, till that period. And then that suicidal ideation just stalked me ever since with the ups and downs of career and things like that.
Well, as I said, there's so much more I want to dig into, but you've had several of us read the book. What's the pre-release reaction to the book?
Yeah, so overall, there's the general public, and then there's my friends and my brothers read it.
Oh, those are the worst.
No, he likes it actually. My brother likes it. Yeah,
All right.
And it's interesting. He said it's your voice. I can hear your voice. But yes, I've had a friend of mine. She had a traumatic childhood, and she said she's having trouble reading it because she's triggered, that it brings up emotions for her.
You write
childhood
about
trauma.
this in the most nakedly honest way I can imagine. I mean, it's really stunning, the courage you had to write all this down and tell us what you went through. Now, you can write it because you come out so strong at the end,
Yeah.
but that was tough.
It was, and I think it's been healthy for me to be able to write it, to just
Yeah.
say what happened, because for so long, because I didn't write it in a healthy way, or I didn't process it, there was so much of a facade. I talk about, later on going on TV and building a TV career or a media career and having a lot of public policy debates and going on shows in front of millions of people, but inside not having found a healthy way to process the feelings of insecurity and self-worth and doubt, that it was a dichotomy. So part of it is, I feel like, just coming clean and just being like, this is what happened. And we need, as a culture, like I said, I didn't write it just for myself. My goal in writing it is to just help address a lot of the mental health issues we're seeing right now.
Well, we talked about before, self-help's become a pejorative, which it is too bad, because you can read this book and all of us have recognition of things we've gone through. And the thing that is interesting, so powerful about you, is you've taken these troubles and you processed it and figured out a way to come out at the other end. And between the time you left Mormonism and became a Christian, what was that, 2017?
Mm-hmm. December 3rd.
You did a lot of things. You found Stoicism, you found cognitive behavioral therapy, which actually works. It's one of the only therapy that does.
Yeah.
But various things, and so it's really a journey through the bad ideas of modern culture and how to come out towards becoming a Christian.
Yes, exactly. I think, like I said, a lot of what's happening in our culture, where we're throwing away what's worked over millennia of the human
Isn't that right?
experience.
Isn't that true?
Because we have suffered pain.
Yeah.
And I did suffer real pain from my dad, who was claiming Judeo-Christian values. Now, my Protestant and Orthodox and Catholic friends will say, well, that's because it's theologically wrong. That's why he was wrong. But the thing is, we see this in other denominations too, where you have, whether it's the pedophile scandal in the Catholic Church, or, corrupt televangelists, or sexual abuse, in the Baptist convention. So this isn't a Mormon-specific problem within the Judeo-Christian value set. And so I wrote it as a challenge to that also, that the reason why a lot of people leave faith is because they've been hurt by Christian people.
Well, it's the human institutions. Once you
Yes.
take the faith and you turn it into an institution, it's gone.
Exactly.
It gets ruined, and it begins to wreck people, and you create all sorts of barriers that have nothing to do with the faith.
Exactly. That you become a stumbling block, as Jesus said, to God. And that is a tragedy, but it's also blocking people from realizing God is not religion. And I think that's part of why so many young people, I know in your show, you have a lot of guests talking about truth and how there's this sense that there's no such thing as truth anymore. And a big reason why so many people believe that is because they have corrupt human beings who are claiming to be a mouthpiece for God. And God is truth. God is light. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. If Jesus is truth, and here you are, a corrupt, abusive human representing him, no one's going to believe the truth because they're so distracted by the evil human being in front of them, So I think we see that. I think that's why a lot of young people, they see the hypocrisy of religious people.
So we've got to get people to read the book, but I have an even better idea for people that are thinking about, you ought to take this book in. You've recorded it.
I've got an
You
audiobook.
do. You're the one that does the audio recording for this. And one of my pet peeves is I think 95% of the people that are hired to read the books are not any good at it. But the only good one I can think of was when Johnny Depp did Keith Richards' book. That was pretty good.
I feel like anything Johnny Depp would be
But
good.
my bet is that this book in your voice it's got to be one of the most powerful things imaginable to listen to.
Well, thank you,
Have
Bill.
you had any criticism any feedback from people who've had a chance? Anyway, I'll send me the audio when you're ready to release it. And
Well, it's interesting you
I'll
say
plug
that,
it.
though, in general, because, and I know different publishers have different methodology, but for mine, I was actually not guaranteed to be able to read it. You're not guaranteed as an author to get to read your
Most
book.
authors are terrible
Yeah.
at it.
Well, you actually have to audition. So I had to audition to
You had
read
to
my own
audition for
book.
your own
Yes. So I am proud to say that I made it. I was bestowed the honor of reading my own book.
So before we close, I have to offer my peanut gallery here. Is there anything we should have asked that we haven't asked in the room?
I think reading the intense details of her childhood are hair-raising.
Yeah.
You didn't go into that as much.
Well, I didn't go into the hair-raising. The question was, should we have covered the hair-raising details of your childhood more? Maybe next time we can do that. When we come back, we get into it. Once it's been released and people have a chance to pick up a copy right away. Why don't we plan on having you back, and we'll talk about some of the, some of the more. What's the word I'm looking for here? Adjective. Help me out here. You're the writer. You got 99 percentile. Anyway, it's vivid. We're going to bring you back.
The
So
more
Kara
colorful.
Sheffield, thanks for being here. This is great. Motorhome Motorhome Prophecies, soon to be coming out available on Amazon. Who's your publisher?
Hachette.
Hachette. And highly recommended. And the audio version, I would suspect, is a very powerful listen. This has been the Bill Walton Show, and as you know, you can find us on all the major platforms, YouTube, Rumble, Substack, and all the major audio platforms. If you like this and you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. If you like it, you are already. Ask your friends to subscribe. Also, please send your comments. We do take them into consideration. It helps guide us towards the next shows we want to do. And as Carrie points out, we are aiming at truth here, and truth is hard to find in the modern world. So we can enlist your help to help us get us there. Anyway, so thanks for joining, and hope you enjoyed just a piece of Carrie Sheffield's story.